My name is Willie Hensley. My Inupiaq name is Raruk. I was named for my grandfather. And my parents were John and Priscilla Hensley, Akpayuk and Nonokakak. I was born in the 40s, just at the beginning of the Second World War, and raised outside of Kotzebue, really, about a dozen miles. And presently I am a distinguished visiting professor here at the University of Alaska in business and public policy. This really was a different world up north. This was before snow machines, before we could really afford outboards of any size. This was before telephones, before we had access to radio. It was our world, and we were still in the dog team age. We had to have dogs to survive, and it had been that way for literally thousands of years. So for our family, it made more sense to live out in the country, a dozen or so miles from Kotzebue, because there are no trees in Kotzebue and there's no alders. And if you lived there, you had to go get wood from a long way off, or if you were lucky enough to have a job to buy oil or coal for heating, that was good. But for us, it made more sense to be out in the country, so we had 3 different sod houses that I can remember as a kid, because you had a foot of earth protecting you from the elements. Although the places were small, they were warm in the sense that, you know, it would take a Prima stove or your homemade stove just a few minutes to warm up the entire space. And so that's how I grew up, basically hunting, fishing, trapping, following my family wherever the seasons took us, you know, and so it was a different world. Well, you know, the world today is so vastly different than when it was when I was a young college student. I mean, we really had no help. We had no career help. We had no tutoring. We had no orientation. And many of us dropped out like flies. We were homesick for traditional food. We didn't have the money to go back and forth. Well, back in those days, the Bureau of Indian Affairs provided the elementary schools, and there were no high schools in Village, Alaska at all, except in a few locations where the federal government decided to put a high school or a trade school. White Mountain was a place that had a boarding facility. So oftentimes there were orphans who were sent there. And once they were done, say, with the 8th grade, they were sent to Eklutna. Eklutna was a big center here outside of Anchorage, where my sister also went. And then, of course, after that, they were sent either to Chilocco, Oklahoma, Chemawa, Oregon, or Sherman Institute in California for high school. But I went to grade school in Kotzebue and Nurvik, upriver. Back then, you know, our life was hunting, fishing, and trapping. That's how we had survived. And it took a lot of knowledge to be able to make a life in that world. So if you had an 8th grade education, and if you could read and write and calculate, that was sort of okay, you know, and then people went on with their lives. But if you wanted to sort of join the Western world, so to speak, and try to become a teacher or you know, sort of a semi-professional, then you know, you had to go get a high school education and then maybe a trade school. I went to finish grade school in Kotzebue, and then I ended up in a boarding school in Tennessee for 4 years. I couldn't afford to come back and forth, so I only came home once during that 4-year period. So I missed a lot with my family and a lot of learning that I could have done at home. But then after that, I went to Fairbanks to the university for a couple of years. But I think I was being treated as a village idiot, so to speak. I mean, they put me into bonehead English when I had 4 years of tough English with Miss Ashley in Tennessee. I knew the parts of the speech. I knew what a dangling participle was, right? And they also put me in bonehead math. And it finally dawned on me that I probably should get out of there. So after my second year, I worked for B&R Tug and Barge in Kotzebue and Wien Airlines, saved up my money, and I was accepted to George Washington University. I thought I could last a semester, but I actually ended up completing my degree there. So it took me 5.5 years to get my bachelor's degree in political science and a minor in economics. After that, I went to Fairbanks because by then I was a useless hunter. I mean, that is, all the things I should have known about surviving and making a life in the bush at home, I wasn't learning all that. Only thing I knew was how to go to school. The big defining moment for me was taking a course in constitutional law at the University of Alaska Fairbanks from Judge Rabinowitz, and being asked to write a research paper on any subject of a legal nature. And this was in January, the spring semester of '66. And I decided to write exactly 50 years ago, right? I decided to write basically on the question of who owned Alaska. The whole notion behind statehood was the federal government was going to basically steal native land for nothing, no compensation, give it to the state, and see if the state could make a go of it, selling and leasing the land, and right. And so that little research paper I wrote called "What Rights to Land Have the Alaska Natives?" This one here was really what opened my eyes to not only the history but the law and the practices regarding American Indians and the land. And I was able to go back in American history and look at how the Indians were dealt with. I was able to look at the Treaty of Cession and figure out what the Russians thought they had, what the Americans thought they were buying, and what was said about Alaska Natives. The truth of the matter is that had we had more facts about history in Alaska during the time that we were dealing with the land issue, which is only one issue among many issues, but a very consequential one, because as a culture you need that space to carry out your existence as a special part of the human race, right? So that was the battle we were fighting, but there were all kinds of other issues as well. But had we known, for instance, that there were less than 800 Russians in Alaska at any one time, I mean, our arguments would have been very powerful, because how can you have sovereignty over a landmass the size of Alaska with that many people, right? I mean, this is sort of a European, Western world game of, sort of discovery, right? In spite of the fact that most of Alaska they never even saw, except for that thin thread between the Aleutians, Kodiak, the Gulf of Alaska, and the edge of Southeast, right? But that gave them enough, legally speaking, in the Western world to give them kind of like a foothold. But it's not like they had control of the space. They didn't have the space. They were after the sea otter. That's what they were after, because it was a low-hanging fruit, right? It was worth a lot of money, especially in the Chinese market. And it was we were under duress at the time, because we could see that the state was beginning to gobble up our lands under the Statehood Act. And when I did my paper, I realized that the moment the Secretary of Interior signed an interim conveyance for, say, a 500,000 acre parcel, we were never going to get it back. Never going to get it back. We were not citizens of the United States until 1924. And even then, once we got citizenship, they began to throw roadblocks into our participation in the political process, right? By making it almost impossible to get the right to vote by literacy tests and whatnot. But even still, the Clinkets made a huge impact on politics because they essentially turned the Alaska Native Brotherhood and Sisterhood into a political force, right? And it made a big impact in Southeast Alaska. We had actually had some influential Native politicians. I mean, Frank Peradovich was one, William Bells was another, and Eben Hobson was another. There were others. But it was, before we had any institution statewide. And that didn't come until the 60s with the formation of the Alaska Federation of Natives. So politically speaking, we were struggling because it was unfortunately, a very racist time. I mean, I can show you covenants over here at Rogers Park and out there at Turnagain Heights, where they had covenants in the land deals that would prevent Alaska Natives from acquiring a home. For instance, in Anchorage, there were the no dogs or natives allowed signs. I mean, even when I was in the legislature, there was a provision that precluded Alaska Natives from being allowed into the pioneers' homes, for instance, which was at that time the only elderly care facility in Alaska, right? And what's significant about '66 was, of course, well, that was the first year I ran for office, because I realized that I had one big issue. There are many issues, but the big one was land. And as a young student with no money, I decided to run for the State House because I realized that I needed to talk to my own people about this issue. And so I wrote this letter, which is now 51 years old, to all the villages in my region. And I borrowed $10 from a guy named Harry Punnick, who was from my region, to buy stamps to send this letter to 11 villages. I said, Dear Village Council and people of Norvik, like this is one of the villages. I had spent time in Norvik when I was a kid in school. I'm writing to your village council because I think an important matter that concerns all of us is not being looked into by Native people in the Kobuk, Selwyn, and Noatak River drainage areas. This is the matter of native lands, the place where we live, hunt, camp, and fish. And then I told them who I was, because I knew they would remember our family, right? I said, for a long time I've been reading about Alaska, the land, and Alaska Natives, mainly us Eskimos. We used the word Eskimos back then. We had a good life in the old days, but now things are changing and we have not much choice but to change too. Our kids must go to school. We all would like better homes, jobs, and enough food. Some of you already have it pretty good, but most of us don't. Some of you have read about land claims made by the Indians in interior Alaska and the claim made by the people of Barrow and the North Slope villages. But at that point, the only thing, we had no media, so the only thing they could do was put this on the post office bulletin board or the trading post. So, but it was enough to get us going, right? I mean, people actually responded to some 25-year-old who'd been gone from home for 10 years. I just thought you might find this interesting. This is June 10, 1966. And this is a response from one of the villages, a small village called Deering. It's on the Seward Peninsula. It says, Dear Willie, sorry we are not able to attend, no funds to travel with, and we just received your letter day before, meeting starting today. And mail and plane won't be here until late again as usual. So that will be too late to go. I'm writing this letter and asking you to represent our village of Deering. I want to thank you for your efforts on this deal about the land situation. More power to you and regards. Alfred Carman. He's long gone. You know, he was a respected elder at that time. And so I was authorized to represent the village, right, in that particular meeting when we were trying to get the land claim. It definitely did lead to the formation of what turned out to be the Northwest Alaska Native Association. I asked people to come to a meeting in Kotzebue the summer of, I think it was in July of 1966, and people actually came. Some people came by boat. You know, some people didn't have the money. The mail was slow. That's the only way we could communicate. And sometimes they got the letter like the same day of the meeting, but they asked me to represent them. So we had, I think, over half the villages represented. And what I did was I had this kind of a crude little cheap map. And after I gave them as much information as I could, I said, what would you like to do? They said, claim it. So I took a big black pen and I took that map and I just made a big circle around all of the region that drained into the Kotzebue Sound. You know, from above Point Hope all the way into the interior to Indian country, all the way down to a portion of the Seward Peninsula. And we took that, and I had everybody at the meeting sign this long piece of paper. And we didn't have an organization at that point. It was just an association of people, right? And so I sent it into the BLM, and by God, they gave it a number, and we stopped state selections, you know. And then, but then I didn't want to be like a self-appointed leader, right? We needed a structure, so I talked to my nephew, John Schaefer Jr., who was at that point working for the National Guard in Nome. And that summer he came home, we agreed to form the association. Well, but we picked about a dozen people and said, would you be willing to serve on the board of what we call the Northwest Alaska Native Association? And they did, and we formed it, and I was elected the executive director. John was the president. We were all, I was 25, John was 27, you know, the others were, you know, 30s and 40s. So it wasn't, you know, it wasn't, we would have preferred not to have made these moves. I mean, to us, you know, in our culture, it was the elders that had the wisdom and the respect, you know, but what we were doing was sort of almost extrajudicial in a sense. But the key person in all of this was the Secretary of Interior, and that was Stuart Udall. He was from Arizona, and he's the guardian and the trustee of native lands, whether it was a reservation, a reserve, a rancheria in California, or an allotment. That was restricted land. But I really think that he sensed that if he signed the interim conveyance to the state, that he might be actually giving away our rights. In a sense, he would have been, right? And he did, in some instances like Prudhoe, right? But then when we started making the claims, it created this sort of bureaucratic inertia. They didn't know exactly what to do. And of course, that's when Governor Hickel began to attack, you know, this so-called land freeze, because he said there was no judicial, no statutory basis for not conveying, you know, the interim conveyance in the land. Only at the tail end, when Nixon won and Udall was going out the door, did he actually withdraw the entire state of Alaska under a little used federal law. I think it was called the Taylor Grazing Act. But that became the super freeze, you see. And so we knew that that when Hickel won, when Nixon won, and he chose Wally Hickel, our governor, to replace our hero, Secretary Udall, that Wally Hickel was going to go down there to try to get that pipeline and get rid of this this land freeze. And so that became a major issue. In fact, you know, John Borbridge just passed on. He was head of the Clinton Haida at that time. The AFN board sent John, Emil Nadi, Eben Hobson, and myself to Washington. Practically had to pass the hat to get enough money for us to go down there, because we knew that if we did not retain that land freeze, our issue was going to be forgotten, because they had found the oil in 1968, right? And they wanted that pipeline. They had a big lease sale in '69 that brought in the first almost $1 billion to the state, right? And by gosh, we knew that if we didn't keep that land freeze, Congress wasn't going to act, because they'd forget about us, right? You need a crisis like that to get Congress to act. So we could not get satisfaction from Governor Hickel because he knew that his job, he was going to give up the governorship to go down there to become secretary in order to get that pipeline built. But we were there to try to protect our rights and to try to get a settlement, because people forget that what we did was unheard of. The unique thing about what we did was we actually went after the land and we got land, you know, and that was very, very unique. Emil Nadi as head of the Cook Inlet Native Association, and of course Emil was probably in his early 30s when he invited us to come to this meeting in Anchorage in the fall of '66. I have right here somewhere the original invite from Emil with a little note saying, could you come a few days early? Anyway, this is October of 1966. Charlie Edwardson was a youngster, a little younger, a year or two younger than me, but he was full of passion, and he learned a lot from William Paul, about land claims, and he helped precipitate the land claim in Barrow for the North Slope. Of course, Byron was a youngster. He was, just a young mayor of Yakutat about that time, although he went to work for the state. And the funny thing about Byron was that when we met in October of '66, we had to throw him out because when they were introducing each other, he said he worked for the state of Alaska, and we didn't want anybody from the state of Alaska knowing what our strategy was going to be, Of course, he eventually came back later representing the three chiefs of the Yakutat, which was kind of a traditional group. Fran Degnan was a classmate of mine from Unalakleet. She became very much involved. Marlene Johnson became very much involved from Hoona. There are a few older people that are no longer remembered, really. Like Jerome Trigg was the head of the Arctic Native Brotherhood, was representing the Nome area at the time. And people forget people like Frank C., who was a legislator also from Hoona when I was in Juneau. Nick Gray was, of course, a generation or so ahead of me. I knew Nick. In fact, his brother, Clint Gray, was married to Abraham Lincoln's daughter. Abraham Lincoln, Okelak was his name. His wife was Blanche Lincoln, and she delivered me, home delivery, and their daughter was married to Nick Gray's brother. And Nick became very passionate about Native organization, and I don't know how he got the wherewithal to travel to Bethel, for instance, to help shape the Kuskokwim Valley Native Association. I know he was instrumental maybe in the Fairbanks Native Association, but he was very influential in trying to get Native people organized. But there was also some other things that preceded AFN. One was a group called Inupiat Peitot, and there was a group called the Association on American Indian Affairs based in New York that was trying to get Native people organized, and they had several meetings, but unfortunately their leader, Laverne Madigan, was thrown off a horse and gotten killed. But she was working with a group a little older than our generation, Howard Rock, Dan Lisburn from Point Hope, Tony Jewell, maybe Al Ketzler. Al Ketzler really is unheralded in the sense that he was one of the early ones to begin talking about Native land claims. In fact, I was a student at George Washington when I saw a little blurb in the Washington Post with a little picture of Al. He had come down there trying to talk about, preserving Native lands. So for anybody who wants to do research, there's a world of possibilities there, because back then, we weren't concerned about history so much as we were just dealing with the problem. We didn't know that we were really engaged in a history-making activity. It was really a desperate fight at the 11th hour to try to get control of our homeland, and we were doing it without funding. It's not as if we had any detailed vision about how we thought things were going to end up, right? We were just desperately in there fighting as hard as we could to try to preserve our rights and to try to get that land, which, like I say, was 180 degrees from American Indian policy of the past. And so when people ask the question about, well, what about this tribe versus the corporate thing? Well, when I spoke to the Bar Association a couple of springs ago, I kind of addressed that. in this fashion. Like I said, if the state was not willing to deal, the land claim situation was going to be ignored in Washington, right? If the natives were divided, that was the other issue. If we were divided, it wasn't going to go anywhere either. It's not like we specifically asked for corporations. In fact, to this day, I cannot find where we even discussed that issue in the AFN board to any significant extent, because we were so focused on getting the land, because it is the land that had sustained us, and it is the land that has given us our identity, right? And so it was not as if we were going down there saying we wanted a bunch of money and a bunch of corporations and we wanted to be businessmen. That was the farthest thing from our minds, you know. But we, as I've said in the past, you know, we would have taken the land if they had given it to the Girl Scouts to hold for us, you know. But nevertheless, you know, so I can see how the critics could look at the settlement and say, oh, you know, it's terminationist. Yeah, it's designed to eliminate Indians as Indians. Well, in a sense, it's sort of true, but just because Congress set it up that way didn't mean that we had to run it that way. But we began to see that we could infuse our corporation with our cultural values, which was what made us unique. And not just the corporation, but the nonprofit, the tribe, the school district, whatever institution was out there that had been created for our use, and in many cases designed to essentially destroy us as a culture. I mean, the classroom was in point, right? I mean, that's where they completely excluded our culture and language and music and art during the Beer of Indian Affairs days, right? And the corporation creates some conflict, but it's designed to try to uplift you economically and also to provide you economic opportunity for a career, right? But hopefully, you know, it'll uplift all of the people, right? That's the hope, and that was our dream for the young people today, to have the opportunities we didn't have. There was, in fact, the corporation in many cases rejuvenated cultural identity in lots of places, and in Kodiak area in Point. You know, where because there was so much colonial pressure in the Russian era and then in the American era, that if you could get away with not being a native, you would, because they didn't want to put up with the bullshit of discrimination and racial prejudice, right? And a lot of the so-called Creoles, they passed for non-native until the Settlement Act came along. And then they had to make a decision. Am I a native or am I not? And then many of them said, yes, I am a native, boom. And so it sort of rejuvenated them as an indigenous people, you know, and they'll say it today, right? And so to me, a corporation is like everything else we receive from the Western world. It cuts both ways, right? It could be used against you, it could be used for you. If we don't maintain that connection between our individual selves, our language and culture and space, Congress will have won. Because sometime down the road, in 50 or 100 years, the question is going to be, do I sell or not sell? And if you sell your stock, of course, the stock is connected to the land. And if you sell your stock, ultimately your land will be under the control of some large corporation. But the fact that we have today village corporations, tribes, regional corporations, housing authorities, health authorities, you know, I mean, and we have enterprises that girdle the globe, you know, and so to me, it is absolutely critical that young people develop a skill, because most of our people are not going to live the way I did, you know, where it was in a time when our parents were still making our own clothes out of our own cot skins and furs, right? Because the Western gear was not warm enough back then, you know, they didn't last very long, you know, and in the little sod house that we lived in, we didn't have a stick of furniture. We didn't have a bed, we didn't have a chair, you know. We didn't have cupboards. Well, we had blazo boxes, you know. And so today's world, you got to have a saleable skill. That doesn't mean that you have to give up your culture. And so a lot of it has to do with their maintaining a sense of their cultural values, a sense of connection to their family and their communities.